This is the new way we work from Fast Company magazine, where we take listeners on a journey through the changing landscape of our work lives and explain exactly what we need to build the future we want. I'm Fast Company Deputy Editor Kate Davis. It's Pride Month, a celebration of LGBTQ representation and a call for action for allies. But this past year especially has been a hard one. Nearly 500, a record amount, of anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced in state legislatures so far this year, which is already more than twice the number of such bills that were introduced in all of last year. And companies are seeing a new wave of so-called anti-woke pushback from far-right groups with a few well-publicized boycotts. But for as much discouraging news, there are many people and companies working to improve LGBTQ rights, and queer people continue to significantly impact the worlds of business, media, and tech. And Fast Company has recognized that impact with our 4th annual Queer 50 list. The list, which publishes on Tuesday, June 13th, celebrates the representation and influence of LGBTQ women and non-binary leaders across industries. The individuals on the list have a seat at the table among the highest ranks of billion-dollar companies and powerful positions in advocacy, politics, and entertainment. They are also, in many cases, doing critical work to ensure that other marginalized folks have access to the same positions in the future. And here to discuss this year's Queer 50 list is Fast Company's senior editor and the lead editor of the list, Julia Hurst. Julia, welcome. And, thank you for bringing us this fun sneak peek the day before, we were saying for super fans, the day before the list comes out.
Thanks for having me.
So there's so much to talk about on this list in the 4th year. Let's start biggest picture. What are some of the biggest themes in this year's list?
Yeah. So as you know, every year we have certain kind of themes and things we want to highlight in the list. This year, we've got a number of folks who are doing HR and DEI work. We've got a nice showing of folks who are in AI and VR and kind of tech across the board, I would say. And then other themes include folks who are fighting for trans people, so fighting against anti-trans legislation, and then also people who are working on reproductive justice.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about, kind of how we put this list together and how we think of whittling it down and who we really want to highlight. And, we're not going to give any way, spoilers. We're not going to scoop ourselves and say who's number one, but we kind of do think about what those big themes are and that we kind of want to rise to the top when there's such a large population to choose from.
Yeah, definitely. I think each year has had different themes that are kind of impacted by what's happening in the news and various economic pressures. And so, we try to think very holistically at the beginning of the process, or sort of what are the big things that are happening in the business and tech world, and then make sure that the people that we pick sort of represent those bigger ideas.
So this is the 4th year that we've done the list. The first year was 2020, which a little insight into how we put it together. We kind of had to change it all at the last minute.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, but something big happened in 2020.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. But what's changed about the list? How does the list evolve from that first year through this year?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, obviously the pandemic happened in March 2020. And so we were really focusing that first year kind of on how business leaders were shifting and adjusting and pivoting, in those very early wild days of the pandemic. I think every year there have been different kind of social events and news stories that, we cover every day in Fast Company that we've then also found kind of echoing in the list. So I think, this year is no exception to that. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of shakeup in the world of work. So it makes sense to have a lot of HR and DEI representation. A lot of interesting and transformative things are obviously happening in tech. And then, as you mentioned earlier, obviously there are a lot of things happening in terms of anti-LGBTQ laws and legislation that's happening. So we wanted to represent that too in the list.
So what's different about the mix of people that are on the list this year and kind of the selection process? I know I'm involved deeply in it, but I think maybe readers might not notice kind of there's some returning faces, some new faces, how we think about kind of the demographic makeup, how this list is also different than a lot of these other lists that maybe rely more heavily on entertainment or celebrities.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we always really try to make sure it feels timely and relevant. So there's definitely an emphasis on past accomplishments in the past year. And that means obviously that some folks stay on, but a lot of folks will fall off, or maybe they're in it the first year and then, not in subsequent. So the whole process starts with an open call for entries, which really kicks off in like January or so. So it's a lengthy process. We go through all of those entries. Obviously we're keeping a list of people who are in the news all year long. We get suggestions from our editorial partners at Lesbians Who Tech and Allies. There are many rounds of kind of narrowing down the list, of editors fighting for their favorites and making some really hard choices. We kind of narrow down the candidates, and then we also get input from a panel of judges to figure out the ranking towards the end of the process.
I will say that, being a part of all of those, there is and something I admire in all of my colleagues that I work with is that we really, really do our research on people. And then the two phrases I feel like we say the most in the vetting process is it their year?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning like, yes, they've accomplished a lot. They have their household name, but like, is it their year? What did they do in the past year? And what is the business case for them? So I think that's kind of the biggest difference between us and other lists. Like, we are a business publication. They may be a world famous best-selling author, but like, what's the business case?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we can think about business case in many different ways. And I think we do. It's not necessarily, is this person a CEO or not, but they have to be impacting sort of the conversation that's happening and, business in some sort of larger, more holistic sense in order to be considered for this list.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a important thing to kind of point out and underline and kind of have in your mind when you're reading this list.
Mm-hmm.
So mentioned it, I mentioned it. I feel like it's kind of the elephant in the room. What a awful scary time it is. It's, this new record number of anti-LGBTQ bills that everyone's, reading about. It's so discouraging to hear it. It's so discouraging to see some of this backlash over things that just seem like rainbow merchandise. It just seems like the lowest, easiest, most banal thing to get upset about. Um, what do you make of all of that? What do you make of this moment? And are we moving backwards, or what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I think it's a scary time to be a queer and trans person right now. There's a lot of organized anti-gay and anti-trans violence happening. It's hard to sort of think about these things during, Pride Month and a time of celebration, but I think they're obviously on everybody's minds. And, there are bans for gender-affirming healthcare and reproductive freedom, and all of this is sort of the backdrop of this list and kind of where we find ourselves. That said, it's also Pride Month, which is a time of celebration and organization and people expressing support for LGBTQ people. So I think all of these things are happening together. I think honestly, it makes a list like this even more important to have during challenging times like this, and to sort of showcase queer people who are triumphing and leading the way in a lot of different industries.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with like that's why lists like this and uplifting these voices and highlighting these people and highlighting the work that they're doing is so much more important. And I try to tell myself too, even though it feels overwhelming, 500 anti-LGBTQ bills is staggering, but it's not. I don't think, and we ran a story recently about how more employees are accepting or welcoming of LGBTQ colleagues. Like it's not everybody. It's not, it's like kind of sometimes in some cases, especially with some of these boycotts and this backlash, it's a vocal minority. But I think hopefully this list is helping swing the pendulum, back in the right direction. So we're going to highlight a few folks from the list that are doing interesting things in the DEI space, especially. But you're so closely familiar with everybody on the list. We've been, as you said, working on this for the last 6 months. What are a couple of really interesting ideas or things that you read about or discovered on the people in this list that you'd want to call out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a huge year of transition for workplaces. Obviously, I would say that as somebody who thinks about work life topics all the time, but I think anyone would say that. I think there are a lot of companies trying to figure out, what hybrid and remote work looks like for people who are trying to go back to the office full time, whatever sort of your work experience is. This has just been a year of transition, right? And so HR teams and DEI leaders are playing a big role in all of these moments. We're seeing on one hand widespread cuts to DEI efforts, especially given economic pressures and layoffs and that sort of thing. But there also have been a lot of bright spots in the space as well. We're seeing moves towards pay transparency, a greater emphasis on mental health, well-being, family building benefits. So it's been a year of big transition, and so we felt like it was really important to represent that with this list.
Yeah, I agree. I was energized, as I always am, to read about some of the kind of more innovative ideas too that people are coming up with. Well, we'll kick it off. We're going to give a couple little preview clips of some of the folks that we highlight on the list. I spoke to Rosanna DeRuthi. She's the Vice President of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at LinkedIn, and she talked about how important it is to hold companies to account for their values, especially for Gen Z.
I mean, I think we all know that, for Gay Pride Month, companies often like to stand up.
Put a rainbow on it. Yep.
They put the rainbow on their logos and they do things like that. But, for someone like me and for many others, being a lesbian is something I do 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, all year long. And so I think our entering generation, the workforce, has an expectation that if companies are doing this, they're doing it all year long. They're standing up for their employees and they're standing up for customers and members, not just when it's convenient, but in those moments when it can also feel inconvenient and even politically uncomfortable, as I would term it. I live in the state of Florida, so everyone knows what's going on here. And I'm proud to work for a company that not only sees the work of diversity, inclusion, and belonging as core to our culture, but acts on that in the same way, whether it's standing up, as part of the amicus brief in Michigan around, LGBT rights and equality, or standing up here in the state of Florida with the Human Rights Campaign when we saw that there's a battle that began with the government and Disney. And at the end of the day, it's about the right for individuals to be who they are, to have the same access to opportunity, to be treated not only with respect and valued, but to have the opportunity to realize their potential. And so, I'm fortunate to do this work, but to do it in an environment with a company that not only advocates for this, but plays an important role in helping companies understand how they can play this role as well.
Talia. Telly Bray is the head of diversity, community, and sustainability for Wells Fargo, and she talked about the company's neurodiversity programs and the increase in rates of anxiety and depression caused by the pandemic.
The investments that we have made in amplifying the enterprise strategy around Black and African American population, Hispanic and Latino, which were two very explicit communities and populations, both internally and externally. We have now much more strategic, significant partnerships with High Tech, an organization that centers Hispanic and Latino tech talent. We have, I think, best in class neurodiversity program we are scaling to the enterprise now, which was really incubated into technology organizations. We have real visibility also, I think, with the LGBTQ plus community that was not there before. We really started to amplify focus on Transgender Day of Visibility. We made investments in organizations that we have not historically supported, like the Transgender Law Center. A lot of these things are firsts that I believe, again, because they're in this operationalized framework, we will be able to continue to build on that. Wells Fargo has representation across not just racial, ethnic, gender, people that identify with disabilities, veterans, but a wide variety of political and social views. Everything from learning styles, communication styles. We're starting to really see the ability to come together and work on common outcomes. It's this really powerful experience as we think about what's happening in the United States right now.
Shamina Singh is the founder and president of the Center for Inclusive Growth at MasterCard, and she talked about the difficulty the LGBTQ community has in accessing credit and how she's in a position to help break down those barriers.
As me sitting as a, queer woman inside MasterCard, I'm always aware of the barriers, but also the opportunities to succeeding. And so I understand that there are barriers in the LGBTQ community around getting access to credit and getting access to assets. And my job is to also understand where the opportunities are and ensure that in the ways that we can, in the ways that we have the ability at this company and me sitting here to provide that access, that I do that. And by creating these Strive communities, by creating these small business enterprises, by creating access at scale, it helps all of us. And I think that that's the part that I want people to know, that I'm here. And I think it makes a difference that you have people like me in positions like this in the private sector, because we can do things that others can't. And we do bring a perspective that others may not have.
Finally, Amber Hikes, Deputy Executive Director of the ACLU, talked about the discrimination queer people of color face and their work advocating for trans and non-binary people.
The work that really sticks with me is that policy work that we did around the experience of trans and non-binary people who were incarcerated. Trans and non-binary and gender diverse folks have more access to rights and to resources, which was challenging work you can imagine to do as an abolitionist. Literally have to sit down with police commissioners and the commissioner of prisons. As an abolitionist, there isn't negotiation. These systems need to be abolished and they need to go a long time ago.
Right.
But that's not an option when you're sitting at the table. And so I would also have these conversations with fellow activists that were saying, like, you shouldn't even be talking to these people. I understand that, but there is a trans person who's incarcerated right now who's on this phone. You're not getting them out. Like, I have to talk to these people, and I have to actually develop these relationships so that when someone is arrested, when they're protesting, the police officers call my office so that we can get them resources. I don't have the luxury of not engaging in that conversation. I don't have the luxury of not negotiating. We were dealing with trans women who were incarcerated with men and did not want to be, or who were put in solitary confinement. That was the only option. Like, we needed to find other options, and you can't do that if you're not willing to come to the table. It's not the direction, it's not the option for everyone. I recognize that, but it's something that I felt was my responsibility.
Thanks, Julia, for coming on and talking to me about this year's list, and we'll be back again next year to talk about next year's list.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all for this episode and for this season of The New Way We Work. We'll be taking the next couple of months to work on the next season, but stay tuned to this feed to hear highlights from other Fast Company shows, an introduction to a new narrative podcast from our friends at Inc., and edited versions of our monthly LinkedIn audio event. If you're a new listener, be sure to subscribe to The New Way We Work wherever you listen. And if you like this episode, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And we want to hear from you. Work is changing every day. What's the most pressing issue on your mind? Email us at podcast@fastcompany.com or tweet us with the hashtag #TheNewWayWeWork. The New Way We Work is produced by Joshua Christensen and Julia Shu with editing by Nicholas Torres.